My name is Ode Chukwuemeka Okpo. First name spelled Oscar Delta Echo Yankee. Last name spelled Uniform Kilo Papa Oscar.
So, I'm sorry, the last name is U?
K-P-O. Yes.
Okay. Dr. Okpo, what is your occupation?
I'm a forensic pathologist.
Okay. And where do you work now?
I currently work at Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's Coroner's Office.
Okay. And how long have you been working there?
I've been working there for a little over a year.
Okay. And do you have a title there?
My title at that office is Deputy Medical Examiner.
Okay. And Dr. Okpo, what is your educational background?
I received my medical degree from Loyola Chicago, and then I pursued a specialty in residency in pathology at the Washington University Barnes Jewish Hospital. After completing residency for 4 years, I did a 1-year fellowship in forensic pathology at the Office of the Medical Investigator in Albuquerque. And I am board certified in anatomic, clinical, and forensic pathology.
Okay. And I'm sorry if I missed that. Are you currently licensed?
Yes, I'm licensed to practice medicine in the state of California.
Okay. And do you belong to any professional organizations?
I belong to the National Association of Medical Examiners, and I'm also part of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences.
Okay. And Dr. Okpo, have you published?
Yes, I've published articles in peer-reviewed journals.
Okay. This is probably a hard one. How many autopsies have you performed?
Approximately 500.
Okay. Have you testified as an expert witness in any court?
Yes.
And where was that?
I have testified in Carlsbad and also in Los Angeles.
Okay. Your Honor, the state now asks that Dr. Okpo be qualified as an expert in forensic pathology.
Without objection. We allow you to provide an expert opinion in that area.
Okay. Dr. Okpo, did you perform an autopsy on Omaree Varela on December 28th, 2013?
Yes.
And did you have any history going into that autopsy?
Yes, I was given a history from our investigator that investigated the scene and the death.
And what was your understanding as to what had happened to bring him to the state?
The initial story that we received was that Omaree was on a horse fighting with perhaps one of his siblings and fell from that horse. And then subsequently we learned that the mother admitted to kicking him several times.
Okay. And did this information inform the steps that you took during this particular autopsy, or did you follow a standard procedure?
I follow a standard procedure, but do take note of that history.
Okay. In what condition was the body when you began the autopsy?
The body was in a good state of condition. There was no decomposition.
Okay. Was the boy of a normal weight for his size and build?
He appeared thin to me, and when measuring his weight, comparing it to someone his age, he fit at the 50th percentile, so right in the middle.
Okay. Did you see any signs of malnourishment?
I did not.
Could you walk us through the autopsy? What all did you do?
So part of the autopsy, the first component of the autopsy is an external examination. It's very much like when you go to your doctor's office, and this is a head-to-toe examination from the outside to see if there are any injuries. And so starting from the head, there were multiple injuries that I found on Omaree from head to toe, and I'll describe those. The first injury that I described was he had on his scalp, this side of his head, he had what is called a laceration. And a laceration is an injury sustained from impact from an object that is not sharp. And the result of that impact causes separation of the skin tissue and causes a tear. So that's what a laceration is. I also, part of the examination, took that skin for sampling to look at it under the microscope, and found that the features of that injury suggested it was days old. And in addition, he had an abrasion above his eye, and an abrasion is an injury that you can think of as a scrape. It is the result of friction along a surface, so rubbing kind of injury. He had a same sort of injury, an abrasion on his upper lip, in this region of the mid-upper lip, and also on his tongue he had a small bruise on the tip of his tongue. And also noted on his examination was he did have a little bit of scarring on the one side of his neck. And in the head, we also, what is performed in the head examinations, we also examined the brain and tried to see if there's any injuries to additional injuries to the scalp and to the skull. And when we looked at the skull, there was no fractures of the skull. But when we removed the skull cap, the brain had swelling, and it was mild swelling. Swelling is a product of when there is lack of oxygen to the brain, and that can happen either by, for example, suffocation or blood loss. So when you lose a significant amount of blood, you lose that oxygen, the brain responds by swelling.
Would this be what ultimately killed Omaree?
No, this is not ultimately what would have caused death. It is just an indicator of lack of oxygen, and in this case, most likely due to blood loss that I'll describe. In addition, on his arms and legs, on his right arm, he had a circular bruise on this portion of the forearm. On his left arm, he had two circular contusions, and contusions are bruises, and he had two of them around the left side of his arm, and then another one on the left middle part of his forearm. And bruises are the result, again, of blunt injury, something that is not sharp. And the way this happens is the blood vessels get crushed as a result to the impact and creates a bruise. And so that's what was seen on his arms. On his legs, on the left leg, his left knee, he also had a bruise on his left knee. And on his left shin, he had a bruise there as well. And now I'd like to describe the injuries that happened to the torso, so this part of the body, the trunk. On the left upper chest, in this region of his chest, he had three distinct bruises in this area. In his back, on his lower back, he had also another bruise. And then on his mid-chest, he had three distinct injuries that were orange, kind of had a waxy appearance to them. And I submitted these injuries for microscopic examination. And on a microscopic examination of those injuries were consistent with thermal injury. So thermal being heat-related injury. The next component of the autopsy is where we open the body much like a surgical procedure, where the body is open with an incision and I can examine the chest organs and also the abdominal organs. When examining his abdominal region, he had on the right side, you have your ab muscles, the abdominal muscles in the front. On the side, there is another muscle in the abdominal region, and that muscle had a hemorrhage in it, so bleeding inside of it, so it can be considered as a bruise on the inside. In addition, his intestines on the outer surface of his intestines had what we call contusions, again, bruising on the intestines. And internally, once we move the intestines to the side, I found bleeding inside the abdomen. And so inside the abdomen was 500 milliliters of fresh blood. And fresh blood meaning that there was no clot formation. And 500 milliliters accounts for Omaree's about 25% of his blood volume. 500 milliliters is if you can think of a 2-liter can, 2 liter of soda, 1/4 of that, 1/4 of that, that is the amount of blood found in the abdomen. In addition, there was on the diaphragm, which is the muscle that sits just below your lungs, both sides had hemorrhage, so contusion like a bruise on the muscle, and the diaphragm is the muscle that you use for breathing, so it's a deep muscle. And when looking further to trying to find a source of bleeding for all the blood that was found in the abdomen, there was blood around the pancreas and also the left, around the left kidney. But we were unable to identify an exact source of which blood vessel caused bleeding, if one or multiple. So likely to be a small blood vessel. And so after examining that, we then take the intestines out so that we can, and the lungs and heart, so that we can examine the back parts of the ribs and the muscles associated with the ribs. And what we found was hemorrhage, bleeding in the muscles associated with the lower ribs on the right and the left. And at that, in essence, concluded the autopsy at the table. The brain was saved for extended examination, and that means we put the brain in a fixative solution called formalin that allows it to harden up so we can adequately examine the brain. And what we noted on the brain after examination was the same thing at autopsy, was just that mild swelling. And at the conclusion of the autopsy, part of what a forensic pathologist does is determine the cause of death. And the cause of death determined in this case was blunt trauma, and meaning death due to a result of blunt trauma, an object that is not sharp.
Okay. Just to go back over a few points you made. You said there was a healing laceration of the scalp about right here on the left side.
That's correct.
And how old do you think that was?
It approximately is days. There's no way to know definitive example for, say, 1 day or 2 day, because there's too many variables in healing. What we understand in healing scientifically is that everybody heals at a different rate. And so it's more appropriate to say days rather than, 1 to 2 to 3, because it's important. It depends on their age, nutrition status, many factors if they're ill. So I prefer to say days.
Okay. So this was not something that could have happened the previous day on December 27th?
If it is within that, it is unlikely. It's given its days, and if that's in 24 hours, then it's not likely.
And what helps you determine that a laceration like that is, not fresh or old? What do you see on it?
And so microscopically, there are different stages of healing where you have the initial bleeding, and then you have inflammation. And inflammation is when you have the immune cells come in and clean up the debris so that you can start healing. So those happen in the early stages of healing. Then there's proliferation. And proliferation is when you get new blood vessels to that area. And you have cells that come in that are trying to build a new foundation and create new skin over that area. And those features is called granulation tissue. So granulation tissue happens in a period of days.
Okay. And I believe you also talked about an abrasion on the left eyebrow.
Yes.
Did you determine how old that might have been?
There's no scientific way to give a date to an abrasion.
That's more difficult.
Yes.
Okay. And again, when you actually went deeper into the head, you said that you found no bleeding in the brain or elsewhere?
No bleeding in the brain, only in the abdomen that I mentioned.
And no damage to the skull?
No damage to the skull.
So basically the only thing you found was the cerebral edema, which I think you explained could have been caused by lack of oxygen.
Yes, and in this case, given the blood loss, the most likely, because blood carries oxygen to your body, so if you lose oxygen that way, that's the cause of the swelling that we see here.
I'd like to touch again on these 3 discrete injuries you said you found in the middle of the chest. Can you describe them? How are they formed? What did they look like?
So they look very much like an abrasion, like a scrape initially, but there was an unusual characteristic to it that it was it was waxy and an orange. Typically an abrasion would be red. It's not very waxy. And that's why I submitted it for microscopic examination, so I can better describe what that injury actually is.
And when you looked at them under the microscope, what did you find?
So in the microscope, what we are able to see are at the cellular level. So your body is made up of cells, organs are made up of cells. And so your skin is made up of, the top layer is made up of what was called squamous epithelium, is a particular kind of cell. And normally that cell has, the nucleus is where the DNA is stored, it's in the middle of the cell. And what we found is they're usually round. And in this case, they were flattened and stretched. This is a feature of thermal injury. Whenever there's thermal injury to the squamous epithelium, they flatten out. In addition, there was one region where
What is that? And
thermal injury is a heat injury, anything from something hot.
could you call it a burn?
Yes, it can be described, a burn is a category, yes, of thermal injury.
And what size were these?
They were about half a centimeter in size. It'll be about 1/5 of an inch.
Okay. Could they have been caused by a child running down the hall and bumping into his dad smoking a cigarette?
With that scenario, I would expect one. In this situation, I saw three.
Is there a possibility that those could have been signs of impetigo?
Impetigo is an infectious condition of the skin, and it is seen in in children and infants. It's highly contagious, and it's not an abrasion. It looks like a rash, and it is the distribution of impetigo is typically the face, neck, hands, and the diaper region in infants. Those features are not seen here in the chest injuries. There's not a rash. Impetigo is not seen on the chest. And it's highly contagious. I would expect that siblings would have contracted it as well. It is advised that children stay home when they have impetigo because it's highly contagious.
Dr. Ukpo, other medical personnel and law enforcement officers were struck by what appeared to be pattern bruising around the boy's nipples and on his groin. Did you determine what that was?
Those, I believe, were not bruises, but rather pigmentation.
Okay. Is that hyperpigmentation?
I believe that it was hyperpigmentation was what was determined because at the autopsy, I look at the skin underneath, and any area of discoloration underneath the skin, if it's a true bruise, it would be seen as bleeding underneath the skin, and in those regions, there was no bleeding.
Okay. Now coming to the lower torso or abdomen, you spoke of extensive bleeding here,
Yes.
and you said you could not pinpoint the source of that bleeding?
No, I could not pinpoint the source of the bleeding. It's very difficult unless the blood vessel that's bleeding is large enough to see. And if it's not large enough to see, it's kind of hard to pinpoint it to one particular vessel. Some vessels are large that we can see, like for example, the aorta, which is the largest artery in the body. You can see injury to those. Here we were unable to, and the analogy I would use is if you were to imagine pipe works, and you can see a large pipe. Imagine a pipe that you can't see, but you see there's leaking there, but you can't see it. It's sort of hard to determine what that pipe was that was actually leaking.
Okay. Did you find any injuries to any major organs like the liver, the spleen, the kidneys?
There was no major injury to the liver or to the spleen or to the kidneys. And when you see blunt trauma to the abdomen, that's one area that you could see injury, and I examined those and did not find injury there.
And again, what did you determine the source of the blood to be?
It is most likely due to small blood vessels that I couldn't see that were associated with soft tissue or connective tissue, the fat connecting to the intestines, for example, or tissues around the pancreas.
And how did the vessels which you saw appear to be? What state were they in?
The larger blood vessels that I could see were intact.
Would you categorize them as healthy?
Yes, they were healthy, apparently.
Did you see any aneurysms or vascular abnormalities?
I did not see any aneurysms or vascular malformations.
And Dr. Ukpo, did you find impact sites on the exterior of the body which corresponded to bleeding in the soft tissues of the abdomen or into the abdominal cavity?
Externally, there was the bruise that was on the lower back, lower left back. That was one site that I saw as impact from the external view.
Okay. So if someone's liver was lacerated, how long would it take for them to die?
Laceration in the liver would bleed significantly, and without help within an hour or so would cause death.
And with a situation such as you found with Omaree, what would happen?
The amount of blood loss was 500 milliliters. And given that it wasn't from a large source of bleeding, I was unable to determine an exact time that it would require to accumulate that amount of blood. The only thing I can say is give an estimate of about an hour to hours.
Okay. How would the patient be reacting?
At that amount of blood loss, there'll be restlessness, anxiety, may appear pale. And the compensation of, it then goes on to altered mental status, where they're sort of out of it in the later stages. And that's would be the later stage.
Okay. Doctor, in your opinion, is it possible that Omaree's life could have been saved?
Objection. This is not a Larry approach. Come forward.
Dr. Ukpo, are there certain guidelines that you physicians would follow as to when medical attention should be sought?
In this case, in emergency medicine, I believe the term is called the golden hour. And in the golden hour is when someone sustains traumatic injury outside of the hospital. Their chance of survival is greatest if they get to the hospital within that first hour of injury. After that, chances of survival drop significantly. And that's why there is rapid effort to remove people from cars, from car wrecks and things like that, because that hour is very crucial.
Okay, thank you. And doctor, based upon your experience and education, were these injuries accidental?
From the injuries by themselves.
Dr. Ukpo, you talked about the cause of death as being blunt trauma. You also gave your opinion about the manner of death, and what was that?
The manner of the death in this case was deemed homicide, which is death at the hands of another is how we use that term.
And how did you come to that conclusion?
From the investigative report, given the confession gave by the mother that she kicked Omaree, that leads to the declaration of that this was due to, that it's a homicide, death at the hands of another.
And based upon what you found in the history that you had received, those two things together brought you to this conclusion?
Yes.
And what about the placement of the different bruises? Did that contribute to your ultimate opinion?
It did. The bruises on the body are, bruises can happen from many different reasons, horseplay or actual fighting, and etc. And so it didn't necessarily lead to a conclusion that this is a homicide, but rather raised suspicion of child abuse. And for the bruises themselves. And just looking at bruises, it's difficult to say the age of those bruises. You can't make a determination that way, but given that the bleeding in the abdomen was fresh, and then also that the head injury was days, it put that together, puts it into a pattern of abuse, child abuse.
Okay. Dr. Ukpo, I have here some items that have been marked States Exhibits 66 through 72. May I approach the witness, Your Honor? You recognize these?
Yes.
And what are they?
These are photos that were taken at the time of autopsy of the injuries and bleeding.
And are they fair and accurate representations of what you saw?
Yes.
Your Honor, the state would move to enter these into evidence as States Exhibits 66 through 72. To be laid without it. May these be published to the jury. Did I turn it off here? Or?
No, it's not. Got the machine.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Cameraman. Right? Right. What are you showing? Which one is that?
Excuse me, this is Exhibit 66. And Dr. Ukpo, what is this displaying?
This is displaying the left side of his head, so you can see his ear below and his hair above. I shaved the region around the injury so that we can see it better. And this is, I'm sorry, the laceration that I mentioned earlier.
67. What do we see here?
This is the left upper chest. So what we have is the left upper chest, and you can see the 3 distinct bruises that I mentioned on his upper chest.
68.
This is a picture of his back, and you can see in the lower mid-back there is a sort of red kind of purple discoloration. That is the bruise in the back that I described earlier.
'69.
And at autopsy, to confirm that this in fact was a bruise rather than a birthmark, I did a superficial sort of examination underneath the skin. And so what you're looking at here is the lower back skin, and once it's sort of peeled back so you can see underneath it. And as you see underneath it, you can see that sort of purplish discoloration on the lower aspect near the forceps, the metal object there. That is bleeding, and that is what a bruise looks like underneath.
And again, do you recall where this was from, actually?
This is from the left lower back region.
Number 70.
This is a picture inside the abdominal region once the skin has been removed, and then you have your abdominal muscles, which would be in the central part. Where you see those loops in the right side of the picture, that is the intestines. And you can see that there's a metal object, a forceps pulling.
You can actually draw on that screen if you'd like.
Oh, okay. And so these are the intestines here. This region here is also intestine, and you can see that there is bleeding on the surface there of the intestine. And this right here is the muscle that is covering the abdomen. And there you can see that there's bleeding here, this purple discoloration. And that is bleeding, so that is a bruise of that muscle.
Clear that, doctor. I think you just hit the lower left.
Correct.
Okay.
71.
This is the examination once the intestines have been removed. The central aspect of this picture here is your spine. And then adjacent to that is, you can see here is the aorta. And you can see adjacent to the aorta, these are your ribs here, the ribs. And below the ribs, you can see that there on the left side here, there's bleeding in between the muscles in between the ribs, and also the kidney would be associated down here, and there's bleeding in the tissue surrounding where the kidney is. And also on the right side, you can see that there's bleeding in the muscles in between the ribs on the right side.
And finally, 72.
This is a picture of the blood that was collected at autopsy. To note that it is 500 milliliters and that it's not clotted, it's fresh liquid blood.
1 minute, Your Honor. And the type of injuries that you found, are they consistent with the fall from a bed or from a bouncy horse?
It would depend on the height of the bed or the horse. If I can be provided with the height of those.
The horse, 29 inches.
I wouldn't expect that from a fall of 29 inches, which is about 2.5 feet. Falling from that, no, I would not anticipate that.
Thank you. Pass the witness, Your Honor.
Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
So, the cause of death was blunt force trauma.
Correct, yes.
And that would have been blunt force trauma to the abdominal region that caused bleeding, that caused the brain to swell, and ultimately the child to die, right?
The bleeding ultimately caused the death, yes.
And that would be what we lay people would just call internal bleeding, right?
Correct.
Okay. And the manner of death would be homicide, right?
Correct.
And based on your investigation, and when I say your investigation, I mean both your autopsy and then other information you received regarding what the mother admitted to, right?
Correct.
So manner of death would be homicide, and based on the information you received, manner of death would be homicide by kicking by the mother, correct?
It's blunt trauma is the cause of death. The implement, I don't speak to that.
But the information you had was that his mother kicked you to death, and that would be consistent with your findings, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk for a moment about some other things, and I think you talked about this on direct examination. During the course of the autopsy, let me ask you a quick question. Dr. Sam Andrews was the supervising forensic pathologist, and you were conducting the autopsy, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And so the autopsy was co-authored by both you and Dr. Andrews, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And before that autopsy was published, both of you would have reviewed it, and if there had been question about some of the findings, you would have discussed these, and ultimately the opinion was pinned, or the autopsy was pinned, and you both signed off on it, right?
Yes, and so the autopsy is submitted to my supervisor. Although I performed the autopsy, he reviews it. Any questions that he has for me, he would go over them with me and ultimately sign off on the case.
So the autopsy would reflect your findings from the physical autopsy, and then discussions between yourself and Dr. Andrews, and the final document would have been submitted for your signatures, correct?
That's correct. I submit a draft of the autopsy to my supervisor, which has my signature, then he finalizes it himself.
Okay. And you were asked by counsel for the state regarding nourishment, and I believe your answer was that there was no sign of malnourishment, correct?
No, and my initial impression was that he was thin, and to be more objective regarding nourishment, I looked at his eye fluid. Eye fluid gives you an idea about hydration, and he was not dehydrated, one, and then two, his weight, based on an average of someone his age, his weight fit right in the middle at 50th percentile.
In fact, the exact language you used was, the decedent was physically and appropriately developed boy. Remember that?
Yeah, yes, I believe that's in the summary and opinion section of the report.
So thus, no finding of malnutrition during this post-mortem examination of the child, right?
Not from my examination, no.
Okay. And not from any examination that you're aware of, correct?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Now, let's talk about the laceration on the child's scalp for a moment. That appeared to be, well, let me back up. Your testimony, which I certainly don't dispute, is that it's very difficult to put an exact age on a laceration, right?
That's correct, given the multitude of variables that influence the healing rate.
And you do have the capabilities of saying if something is a fresh wound, right? Like a fresh gunshot wound or a fresh stab wound, right?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. In this case, the scalp laceration was not fresh.
No, I would not describe it as fresh because of the granulation tissue that I saw.
And the granulation is part of the healing process, and that's not immediate. It happens over a period of time, right?
It happens over a period of time, and what we understand scientifically is in a matter of days.
Matter of days. All right. And so the laceration to the child's head would not have been included in any way as the cause of death, correct?
It would not have, given that there was no traumatic injury associated with that would have caused death in of itself.
Okay. Now, there was an abrasion on the child's eye or above the child's eye. Much more difficult to even begin to date an abrasion, right? To gauge the age of an abrasion.
Yes, that would be difficult, and it would require a microscopic examination, but even then that would be difficult because it was red and bleeding, which would it would be difficult to give an exact time for that.
Now, the laceration above the eye, and you've talked about kind of the constellation of injuries led you to suspect child abuse, but the laceration on the eye, that certainly didn't contribute to death of the child, correct?
It did not contribute to the child's death, no, to Omaree's death, no.
Okay. Not laceration, the abrasion. The abrasion you described as a scrape or a scratching of the skin, which leads to maybe perhaps minor bleeding, but certainly nothing to cause a flow of blood, right?
Yes, so you can imagine like scraping your knee kind of injury. The scalp has a rich vascular supply, but an abrasion wouldn't cause significant bleeding that would lead to death.
That's why when we get a nosebleed, lots of blood comes out of our nose, right?
A fair amount of blood can come from the nose, yes, in a nosebleed.
But this abrasion, it would have been consistent with the example of scraping your knee or scraping your elbow on something, or not a lot of blood flow, right?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Likewise, the abrasion on the upper lip is going to scrape, more consistent with a scraped knee or a scraped arm rather than, say, an open wound, correct?
That's correct. And an open wound, I interpret as what would be as like a laceration is an open wound with the separation of the skin.
Okay. Revealing the blood vessels, which would allow more blood to flow from the body, correct?
Lacerations bleed much more significant than abrasions.
All right. Now, let's talk for a moment about the mild swelling of the brain. I believe to understand that as the brain is deprived of oxygen, it begins to swell.
That's correct.
And as the blood loss began to become more significant, the child would have begun to experience a loss of oxygen or a lack of oxygen to the brain that would have caused the brain tissue to swell.
That's correct.
Okay. And this would have been a slow swelling.
Yes, it was perhaps a slow swelling, given that it wasn't it was described as mild at the time of death.
And that would be described as symptomatic of how the child died, not a cause of death, right?
Not the cause of death, but rather a symptom of or a sign rather of the blood loss.
Okay. Now, you observed circular bruises on the left arm, one circular bruise on the right arm, and two circular bruises on the left arm?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And neither of these would have contributed to death, right?
No, they were painful, but wouldn't have contributed to death.
And bruising, as you discussed, can be caused by any sort of blunt force trauma, if it's significant enough to crush blood vessels under the skin, right?
Yes.
Okay, so things like bumping one's knee or falling off a bike or horseplay, as you've described, those can all cause bruises. I mean, we've all been kids, right?
Yes, kids can bruise given when they're running around and being able to play, that they can bruise from falling.
And it is impossible in your profession as a forensic pathologist to date a bruise, right?
Many have tried, and it's still an ongoing science. It's purely speculative at this point, meaning that it's just a general hunch that some people feel they'll make statements, but I don't think the science is good enough.
Okay. And then there was a bruise in the left knee and a bruise in the left shin?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, the circular bruise on the child's the circular mark on the child's arm, There's been testimony that that was believed to be a bite of some kind, a bite mark of some kind, correct?
The examination of the bruise was done by a forensic odontologist, and this individual specializes in identifying patterns of injury that would be consistent with a bite. And in his report, he declared that the circular bruises were suggestive of a bite, and those terms are better asked by Dr. Loomis to describe what those mean for you, because that's not my area of expertise.
And I'm not asking you to offer an expert opinion. It's contained in your report, but the doctor, the odontologist did indicate that it was suggestive of a bite of a small child, right? A small human?
Yes.
Yeah. Not an adult human bite, more suggestive of a bite from a small human, but that's as far as you could go.
I believe that's, yes, in his report, yes.
Okay. And we talked about some discolorations on the child's chest around his nipples, right? And then in the groin area?
Yes.
And your conclusion after having examined the child subcutaneously was that was hyperpigmentation of the skin, correct?
That's correct.
Which is not caused by trauma, it's caused by discoloration of one's skin, correct?
Yes, in fact, you could potentially be born with hyperpigmentation in your skin.
Okay. All right. The patterns on the child's chest, you indicated in your report that it is suggestive of a thermal event, right?
Yes.
And suggestive of the thermal event could have been caused by a cigarette, certainly, and you were given the hypothetical of bumping into someone with a cigarette, right?
Yes.
And that's, while you would expect to see one, certainly more than one is not out of the realm of possibility, right?
The scenario of running down the stairs and running into a cigarette, again, is not consistent with three of them. I couldn't make that conclusion.
Couldn't make a burn is caused by a source of thermal energy on the skin, right?
Correct.
Say like ashes, perhaps, or an ember.
I don't know the heat of an ember and how long that would be sustained to cause injury, but directly from a cigarette, the temperature on a cigarette tip has been measured as up to 750 degrees Fahrenheit, so very hot.
And that would be what would be in layman's terms the cherry of the cigarette?
Yes, we're at the very end of it where it's burning.
Okay. All right. And should that become detached and land on the skin, that would cause the burn or the thermal event you've talked about, correct?
If it were to be detached from its heat source and to fly into the wind, the heat dissipates once it's taken away from its source, so I don't anticipate the same amount of heat given from an ember, but it's unknown what that heat measurement would be.
All right. Now, let's talk for a moment about the blunt force trauma that did indeed cause this child's death. So, we've seen the photographs. During your autopsy and during your direct examination, you indicated that you believed, that you opined that blood vessels were ruptured somewhere in the abdominal area that caused...
Yes, that's correct.
But that's misleading in this case because you discovered no laceration on the liver, correct?
There was no laceration of the liver, and I took photographs for individuals to review that to agree with my findings. Yes.
So when Mr. Jensen asked you about a laceration of the liver, that's not something that you determined had any cause, that you could determine was a cause of the blood source, right?
Not in this case, no.
Okay. Now, in fact, this becomes rather complicated because during the autopsy, you're taking out the organs and you're searching the organs for that source of blood, right?
Correct.
To see if there's a tear or a rip or an abrasion or a puncture, right?
Correct.
And in this case, this child he's 9 years old, and his organs were otherwise well formed, right?
That's correct.
And as you removed the organs from the child's body, you were unable to discover the point of the blood loss, right?
That's correct. Rather, it was just a general area of bleeding.
which would indicate that there were perhaps several small blood vessels that were ruptured that caused the bleeding that ultimately led to his death, right?
It's possible that, yes, more than one smaller blood vessel.
And a small blood vessel versus, say, like the femoral artery or the aorta or the artery in our neck, the small blood vessels would hence the term, hence small, they would bleed much slower, right? Blood vessels versus veins versus arteries.
Yes, and I will use that pipe analogy I gave that, imagine it's a small pipe where you just can't see, it can leak very slowly.
Which means, I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that you had the trauma, whatever that trauma was. In this case, you were led to believe that it was the mother kicking the child. Then you would have had the injury, and then you would have had a relatively lengthy period of time prior to death, right?
I can't speak to the exact length of time, given that it's a small blood vessel, and I don't know how long that blood vessel would leak, other than to estimate an hour or hours.
And you had the opportunity to be interviewed by an attorney for the defense, correct? Ms. Leos, perhaps?
Yes, that's correct.
And she asked you specifically about being able to time the event versus when it would become fatal, right? The trauma, then the bleeding, then the death, I think. And she asked you...
I believe so.
Okay. And she asked you that these blood vessels would cause the blood loss. She asked you if it would be hours or days, right?
That's correct.
And you were able to rule out days, right?
Yes, given that days, what you would expect to see is blood clot formation, which is the first step, and it would have been in days.
And then she asked you, okay, it's not days, more likely hours, and you were asked about more or less than 12 hours, right?
I don't recall the numbers, but I do recall a discussion about different hours.
And the best you could get was it would take hours for this child to die from this blood loss, right?
At the time of the discussion, I believe I said hours, yes.
Okay. And so when Mr. Jensen talks with you about this, the golden rule of 1 hour, your indication that it would have taken hours for this child to die based on what you know, based on the autopsy, right?
Well, again, I say that hour to hours is what I would state, and which is just a very broad range, which is it's a range of possibilities.
Well, you're saying hour to hours now, but when you were interviewed back in on April 24th, you said hours. So, what is it, doctor? Hours?
I'd just like to give it as a range as hours in terms of time.
Okay.
That's just in the realm of possibility. That's what I meant by hours. You have this range.
That's fine. All right. And so, given the state of this young child's body when he arrived at your office for the autopsy, I think you'll agree with me that that based on what you found, based on the way the body was intact, that there wouldn't have been a source, the trauma wouldn't have caused immediate blood loss, right? Like there wouldn't have been blood spilling out on the ground, or he wouldn't have had blood coming out of his mouth or anus or any other orifice at the time of the trauma, right?
That's correct. Given that I suspect a smaller blood vessel, I don't expect such a dramatic amount of blood loss, rapid blood loss.
So there wouldn't have been this outward sign of an immediate need to seek help. Like if I'm throwing up blood or blood's coming out of my anus or leaking out of my ears, I think a layperson's going to get that person to the hospital. But we don't have that in this situation, correct?
And so we don't have, so what we have here is the amount of blood loss was 500 milliliters. And given that amount of blood loss is, there's anxiety and restlessness. The bruises are, painful, so he would have been in pain. But the thing about bleeding is that when you're bleeding internally, you don't necessarily feel it. That doesn't cause pain in itself. What you do see are the changes in the mental status that occur over time, slowly over time, and then getting to the point where they're sort of out of it. And that's when help may have been identified as necessary.
Okay, and let me stop you there.
Okay.
And I want you to continue this line, I want to direct you a little bit. So I think your expert opinion would be that after the trauma, the child's condition would have deteriorated over a period of time, but would have only appeared acute when there was a significant amount of blood in the stomach, right?
Given a child, yes. Children can appear okay and then suddenly drop precipitously. And
Which are the question? May I have a moment, Your Honor? No further question, Your Honor. Pass the word. Redirect.
Dr. Akpo, there may have been some sort of a misunderstanding when I asked about, hypothetically, about the laceration of the liver. I did not mean to suggest that that was in any way related to what happened to Omaree. I just wanted to hypothetically...
Yeah, I'm waiting for it. I'm waiting for the question.
Okay. Laceration of the liver, can we compare that to what happened with, the rupture of these small vessels? How would the laceration of the liver present itself, and what would happen?
There is no laceration.
No speaking.
Let me approach the bench here. How would the laceration of a major internal organ like the liver compare to what you observed as several small vessels rupturing?
the liver has several blood vessels because a lot of blood goes to the liver as to be filtered. So a large amount of blood would be seen as a result of a laceration in a shorter amount of time. A smaller blood vessel in comparison here is much, it would take much longer time than observed in a liver laceration.
Okay. Dr. Akpo, you said that a child would appear to be okay and then it could show a precipitous drop with an injury like this?
And being okay as in regards to he may have been in pain from the other injuries, but in regards to speaking to the bleeding progressing, there are no symptoms associated specifically with the bleeding. And so the child could appear just as he was in pain from the initial injury and then subsequently suddenly have restlessness and anxiety, and then followed by altered mental status.
Would he show signs prior to this precipitous drop, as you called it, that would indicate he needed medical attention prior to that drop?
I don't know if he would have given signs or conveyed symptoms that would have suggested he needed to go to the hospital immediately. He wouldn't have been watching TV, eating, playing, laughing, given the injury, because it's painful, the bruising. But indicative of need for immediate medical care, it's uncertain when that would have happened.
further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. We need to keep talking.
No, he may be excused.
Thank you.